Greetings, everyone. I'm Monica Rhodes, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce my video series, Three and the Possible. As we know, histories are often multi layered, and the name of the show is no exception. If you are a spades player, then you know this is the phrase you would use when you're trying to predict how many books you have in your hand to win. It also represents the essence of cultural preservation, which is not just a conversation about the past, but one that concerns the future as well. Three and the Possible is predictive. Through this series, I will be chatting with experts in the preservation space and asking three and possibly four questions per interview. This is a free flowing conversation with my community of practice, my friends. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nikita Reed to Three and the Possible. Hello, Nikita.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to get the invite. Yes.
Of course, of course. So we're just gonna jump right in. So, Nikita, what's fun about the work that you do? What are you passionate about? What are you up to these days? So let's just kind of start with what's fun for work for you
Yeah.
these days?
So, what's fun for me is that it is never the same day twice. I was a little bit late to this situation, mainly because I was on a site visit that ran a little bit long. So, I spent my morning inside the vacant and abandoned Ambassador Theater in Baltimore, Maryland. So, I was there with the structural engineer. And so, it was great to be able to just be in a vacant building. And while I was in there looking around, thinking about what we're redesigning it to be and how we're going to really impact the community with the redevelopment, I was like, I get paid to stand in vacant buildings that most people will probably be like, oh, this is a scary movie, but it's a
Mhm.
great time. And I love being able to be in buildings and imagine what they could be. So it's always a different day.
Yeah, that's great. So what brought you into that work? So we know as preservationists, I don't know if people know this about, but preservationists are known to like, kind of break into buildings and kind of like let's peek in and through the window and
Yeah.
see.
The number of
I've
buildings
been
I
known
have
to,
trespassed in. Yes, it's true.
yeah. I've been in cemeteries before.
Great.
That's the fun part of the work that we do because we're so passionate about these
Exactly.
sites. But what brought you into these fields?
Yeah.
How did you fall in love with vacant
Yeah.
buildings?
So for me, architecture and preservation have always been one and the same. So when growing up as a kid in Northern Virginia and going into DC a lot in the early 90s, the DC of the early 90s is not the DC of today. And so as a child, it did not make sense to me why I was seeing so many homeless people sleeping outside of vacant buildings. And so in my mind, I was like, why don't we just fix up the buildings and then people will have a place to sleep and be warm and be safe. And so that's what got me into the work. And then went to architecture school, realized that we didn't really talk about existing buildings that much. I had one or two classes, shout out to Professor Nelson at UVA, in historic preservation. But for the most part, it was just new construction. And so that's when I realized that preservation was a whole separate field that I needed to go into and learn more about. It really is an art, a science. There's more to it than just architects playing preservationist. It is actually a field. And so I went in and got my master's at Penn and did both because I was like, I wanted to do architecture and historic preservation because they were always connected for me. And so it was great to be able to also have internships and work with other preservation architects and meet many people in the field who are doing this kind of work because although it feels like we've been having the same conversation for the past couple decades, none of this is new. And so it's been great to learn from other mentors and other people in the profession as well.
Yeah, that's great. I want to go back to your internship experience because so many people watching, I was heavily influenced by my internship experience. So, and please tell me what types of internships that were you able to do to prepare you
Yeah.
to be where you are now?
Yeah, so I did a number of internships. I did some I spent a couple of years at a small architecture firm in DC. And then during grad school, I worked at a bigger architecture firm where we were able to also, they were doing more preservation. So like the renovation of the Philadelphia City Hall. So being able to go onto the top of City Hall and learn some things that worked and didn't, particularly like bird and pest deterrent things to do and not do. And so being able to really connect with different professors or different practitioners who would come in and do guest lectures, who are also looking for staff, was a really great way to be able to expand the internship. I also had an internship at the National Trust where I was one of the sustainability interns under Patrice Fry before she went over to Main Streets. So it was great to be able to get both of my passions of preservation and sustainability mixed together. Because for me, preservation is about sustainability. Preservation is about the future. What are the stories that we want to carry from the past into the future? And then how do we also frame it so people care about what's happening? A lot of things that surprise me within the work that I do is the number of people who I meet who are like, well, what do existing buildings have to do with sustainability? And I'm like, oh, we're starting there. Okay, that's good baseline. Good to know that's the level that we're starting at. And it's like, it has everything to do with sustainability.
Right.
Existing buildings are like the focus, even though people don't realize it. And so one of the things that I often talk to other students and other people about is the fact that we have so many existing buildings that will one day potentially be historic. And while not everything needs to be preserved, everything should be reused when possible. Because from a sustainability standpoint, from a carbon standpoint, we don't have time to throw everything away and start new. We're not going to build our way to net zero, and we really need to deal with the trillions of square feet of existing buildings that we have. And one of the things that I often think about is the fact that I guess as humans, we don't have a great intuitive scale of how big quantities are. So for instance, when you think about time, 1,000 seconds is about 16 minutes. 1,000,000 seconds is about 12 days. 1,000,000,000 seconds is 31 years. So like the scale between 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000 is something that we don't often think about. And so when we're talking about trillions of seconds of time, that's 31,000 plus years. And so when we think about, we have trillions of square feet of existing buildings that we need to work with and improve, do deep green retrofits, make them more sustainable, high performing, all that. That's something that excites me because there is so much opportunity for all of us to really get in there and make a difference and show a lot of these buildings some love.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think if you don't have a conversation about sustainability if you're not talking about existing buildings. Like there's no, it's the elephant in the room, it's the building in the room, it's what you're talking about.
Exactly.
But you know, to your point, like far too often, you know, sustainability preservation is kind of left out of these conversations, or it's an afterthought. And
Right.
you know, not to press you too hard, but like, you know, why do you think that is? Like, why is the sustainability sector, you know, not thinking about, or why isn't preservation, you know, moving faster into this space of sustainability?
Yeah, so it's been one of those things where I think it's just so much of this work is done in silos. And so one of the organizations that I'm a part of is the Zero Net Carbon Collaboration for Existing and Heritage Buildings. And so it's a collaboration between the American Institute of Architects, the APT, which is the Association for Preservation Technology, Architecture 2030, ICOMOS, RAIC, and Passive House Alliance, because we realized that there's a number of organizations that are focused on sustainability, zero carbon energy, net zero, but they weren't talking to each other. And so part of it is just, I think the work is done in silos. Sometimes the environmental folks are only thinking about solar panels, trees, water. They're not thinking about the operations of buildings and how much carbon and how intense and energy intensive it is for us to operate our buildings. And sometimes on the preservation side, we're only focused on the buildings and the technology of it, and we're not thinking about the trees, the waters, the impacts that the buildings have on the context. And so really being able to bring that context together and connect that to something that I've really been enjoying doing. Because it's even in architecture school and even in preservation school, you may have had this too. But some of my architecture colleagues at Penn, they're like, oh, preservationists, they just get in the way. It's the hysterical committee. Oh my gosh. And then some of my preservation colleagues were like, oh, architects can't design. Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings leaked. And I was like, hold on a second, wait a minute. Architects, I need you to be designing buildings that preservationists are going to want to preserve and fight for in 50 years. And preservationists, architects are giving us some job security, designing great things. There's so many things for us to do. There's enough space in this field and in this profession for all of us. But I always thought it was interesting how there was such a dichotomy between the two. I was like, come on, y'all, what are you talking about? And then throwing in sustainability folks, I'm like, y'all, come on. come join us. And so it's like the more that the conversation is shifting so that people are starting to understand that building reuse is climate action. And there is such a need to be having these conversations that are multi-layered across many disciplines, because we really don't have time to try and solve it on our own. We really need to be working together to try and see how we're going to adapt to this new situation that we find ourselves in with the climate.
Right. All in together, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
thinking like I appreciate like thinking in systems, right? So we're trained in silos, but to be effective, to have the level of impact that we all at the human scale, we need to have systemic thinking. We have to elevate from our current spaces, our current trainings, and develop a new language that we all can speak to move this ball forward. So
yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Great point. You know, related to that though, thinking about systems and, you know, moving from preservation architects to now thinking about developers. So when we were at the trust conference and we missed each other by a day, you know, I heard great things about the historic tax credit session. So can you talk a little bit about that and tell us a little bit about your work around historic tax credits and what are they? Because we haven't really gotten into that space at all on Three and Impossible.
Yeah, so all right, so historic tax credits are a financial tool that can be used mainly by developers to help renovate their buildings and close the gap. Because a lot of times reusing existing buildings makes a lot of sense from an environmental standpoint, from a community standpoint, and even a heritage and preservation standpoint. But sometimes you need that extra financial incentive and bridge to be able to make the numbers work. And so what the historic tax credit does, it provides you 20% of your qualified rehabilitation expenditures towards a project. So let's say that you are going to be gutting a whole building and you know, we're going to preserve everything that you can, but then there's some things that are going to have to be new. Basically 20% of those expenditures can be applied as a tax credit. One of the misconceptions that often happens when it comes to tax credits is people think that it is cash upfront. It is not. It's a tax credit that goes towards your income producing building. So the building has to be income producing. It has to stay that way for at least 5 years. And I should also mention, it does have to be a certified historic structure. So it needs to be either individually listed on the National Register or in a National Register historic district, or if you're going after a state tax credit, then it needs to be in a state or local historic district. One of the great things about the tax credit is that it can be combined. And so there's about 35, 36 states that have historic tax credits at the state level. And so you can combine that state tax credit with the federal tax credit. So you can get 20% state, 20% federal. So 40% of your costs could be covered in historic tax credits. The reason why many developers are really excited about tax credits is because you can syndicate them in certain levels. And so basically there is a brokerage market for people looking to syndicate tax credits, and they'll say, hey, you're going to get $5 million in tax credits. I would like to syndicate those tax credits, and I'll give you like 80, 90 cents on the dollar at the front end of your project as equity in cash that you can then use to do the work. And then on the back end, once the building is complete and complies with all of the things that are needed, then you'll give me the tax credits, and that can help with my tax liability. That is a very high level, quick way to think about it. And sometimes it does sound a little shady, but I promise it's legal. But it's really just a way to help the money flow into the projects, to help the work get done, and then help reduce some liability or tax liability for people who have a heavy tax burden. And so we've helped clients get millions of dollars in historic tax credits and at many scales of projects. So even from we're working on with one client right now where they're doing transitional housing for formerly homeless youth. And we got them about $6 million in historic tax credits. The Ambassador Theater, where I was today, we applied for tax credits. So we're waiting to find out how that's going. But theoretically, that'll be another $5 to $6 million in tax credits there. And so it's a really great tool that architects can help developers use and implement on projects. I will say that you need to be as talking to my developers right now, you need to work with an architect who understands how historic tax credits work, not just an architect who plays preservationist on the weekend, because that's not going to work. The number of architects who we have tried to rescue and save them from themselves because they're doing things that are not compliant with the Secretary of the Interior standards, or they're doing things that are going to jeopardize the tax credit and all that. It's real. But that's why, me and my colleagues at Quinn Evans, shameless shout out, are great at what we do. And we work with tax credits and adaptive reuse all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that distinction between, you have architects and then you have architects that specialize in preservation or preservation architects. Yes. And to that point, Nikita, that's not a huge field. There are not preservation architects just rolling around, walking down the street. Like it's really challenging to find professionals who are both and. And so, and I appreciate you sharing your story about how you got into architecture, you followed that path and still realized that there was this huge gap of interest that you wanted to pursue. So going back to the historic tax credit question, and just want to understand that a little bit more, could you repeat, you got the state historic tax credit as well as the federal. How much could a developer get up to if they were to be able to combine or stack those?
Yeah. So, and actually I'll use Baltimore, Maryland as an example. And so in Baltimore, there is a 20% state tax credit. You can get 25% if your building is LEED Gold or higher. So that's already combining sustainability and historic preservation. There's also a 20% federal tax credit. So in Maryland, if you were to do a LEED Gold building and go after state and federal, you would be able to get 45% in historic tax credits. Additionally, in Baltimore, there are certain projects in certain areas where you're able to also get a local historic tax credit through CHAP, which is our local historic commission. And that, in essence, is kind of like a property tax freeze. So basically, you pay the same amount of the property value that the building is before it's renovated. That's what you'll pay for a certain number of years after it's renovated as well. So it's a way to be able to combine the local, the state, and the federal tax credits, and being able to work with architects, developers, CPAs who understand how the tax credits work together is something that is huge and could be a game changer for many projects.
Yeah. I just wanted to again just double click on that, because that's the important piece. People think about preservation like, oh, we're preserving for preservation's sake because the beauty of the building or the history of the building, the architectural significance of the place. Certainly there's that sustainability argument, but right. There's also a financial incentive for being a part of this ecosystem. And I don't think enough developers are leveraging that. And not just the development with a capital D, but I'm also thinking about people who own income producing properties, right? So they're a part of this as well. If you own a historic apartment building or one in a district, this conversation is for you too.
Exactly. And the income producing, when we're saying that, so a rental property, a small multifamily, it doesn't have to be the big, massive theaters and 100-unit buildings. If you have a duplex, a quadplex, whatever, like there are different ways that you could potentially work. And actually, I know Maryland also has a homeowner tax credit as well. So definitely talk to your state historic preservation office, your SHPO, to see what tax credits are available in your area, because you may be surprised of the incentives and or grants that are available to do the work that you want to do on your historic properties.
Yeah. So thinking again for those watching, when we talk about these systems, every state has a state historic preservation office. And so we use the word SHPO, so that's what we're using around. And then there are local commissions, and so there are these different tiers of ways that normal folks can get connected into this space, because historic buildings are everywhere. Historic buildings, they're public assets, not in the sense that like national parks, like they belong to the American public, but we've all walked by a historic synagogue or church or cemetery, or we've bar hopped in a historic warehouse, when they have all the buildings lined. Like everyone is interacting with historic places in different ways every single day, and we just aren't paying as much attention as we need to. So these are ways for people to get involved in this. So Nikita, here's a question that I ask everyone, because we talk about how preservation is a conversation that not just concerns the past or the present, but we're having a discussion with the future. We're transmitting our highest and best values, what we think is important to preserve about who we are and what represents us to future generations. So from your perspective, as one of the very few preservation architects out here, killing the game, what do you think? What is the future of this field? What's the future of preservation architecture, or just preservation in general?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's going to be more sustainably focused. At least I hope it's going to be more sustainably focused. I hope that it is also leveraging all of the tools at our disposal. I love talking to students and telling them how, as a preservationist, we get to use drones and laser scanning and all of the fun tools that they often equate to only new construction or other types of technology. I'm really excited and interested to see how AI is going to change how we're dealing with preservation, how we're doing different studies, how we are explaining things and helping people interact with the past in a way that gets them more excited about it. I'm also really excited and hopeful that the field will continue to diversify. For the longest time, preservation was thought of as just something that was really only for like older white folks, and those were the main stories that we were telling, we being like as the professional field. So I love that we are actually expanding the story to really focus on what's happening in Black communities, Asian communities, Hispanic, LGBTQ, what's happening and what are the stories that have been important and of the people that have been here the entire time. David McCullough has a great quote where it says, "History is no longer a spotlight. We're turning up the house lights to show people who've always been there." Because I think for so long, the spotlight has just been on the old white dudes, founding fathers, all that sort of thing. And even those stories were so myopic, they weren't telling the full story of people who were enslavers and the lives that they were impacting and all of the messiness of the true history. And so I think preservation is getting better at telling the fuller story. And I really hope that continues. And then I'm also really excited about the potential that preservation has to just help people be more compassionate, to re-educate people, to learn more about the history of our country and all of the history of our country. Because I think for so long, there's such a gap in knowledge that has led people to think and believe in the myth of white supremacy that, oh yeah, clearly this is where it needs to be because white folks are the only ones who've done anything, but that's absolutely a lie. And so being able to use preservation as a tool and existing buildings as the receipts to be like, we've always been here. These buildings, this person here, this person lived here, this person's life was impacted by this building, this person built this building, these people laid the foundation for this neighborhood. And so being able to tell more of those stories is something that excites me about the field and the profession. And I'm optimistic that that's the way the field will keep on going.
Yeah, man, that is beautifully said. I as you were thinking, I was, you're talking, I was also thinking about, we talked about this, how, preservation is just just one of the strongest tools for a stronger democracy.
Absolutely.
Right. So when we're telling these expansive stories about, everyone's contribution can be acknowledged in these spaces through how we are, how they tangibly represented on the landscape. Yes. Like who gets to take up space, and right. if preservation does its job right, then the question is everyone's story can have a space, because we have so much land and yes. There's so much history. There's multi-layered history. Exactly. In these spaces, and why shouldn't we have these multivocal narratives, right. That celebrate that? Yeah. So it's one of the strongest tools we have to yes. honor this country.
Yes, and one of the things that I love about it, and one of the things that I get excited about when I see preservationists of any color coming up through the universities, is that the more diverse the field, the more the stories will expand. One of the things that I'm working on, I've been grateful to work on with Sarah Schoenfeld of Prologue DC and Derek Musgrove. We're working on the Black Power context study for the National Park Service, as well as we just did a 20th century civil rights sites in Washington, DC. And so working on those context studies to really be able to lay the framework so that as future researchers come up and they want to keep doing research on different types of buildings and properties, they'll be able to use our context studies as the basis to do their nominations to the National Register of Historic Places. And so getting more people to understand how the process works with the National Register, the importance of getting buildings listed and being able to memorialize and really document more of the history is going to be important, because for the longest time, preservation has only focused on architectural integrity of buildings, but we're getting into the point where we're starting to talk about histories and cultural histories and narratives that happened in buildings that aren't architecturally beautiful, that were purposefully disinvested in because of redlining and racism and all the things. And so how do we also make sure that we are using preservation as a tool to preserve some of those sites that also need to tell the story of what happened in cities and places around the country? So I'm excited for preservation to keep helping build the layers, as you're saying, and really strengthen the democracy to show this is what happened. It's real, facts are facts, and here we are.
Yep, absolutely. So I don't normally do this, but I see a question in the chat or a comment about some SHPOs not having enough capacity to help clients walk through the process fully.
Yes.
And I think you may have an answer for the company that you work with. So I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, so I mean, there are amazing architecture firms like Quinn Evans, where I work, that can provide this service. But then I will say SHPOs may not have the capacity to walk you through this whole process, but they still have a number of resources where they can direct you to where to go. So SHPOs typically are always our first stop. Whenever we're working on a project, we like to talk to them early and often to engage the conversation. I promise they're not as scary as they seem. They're a lot of great people, and they're really there to help, because SHPOs want to make sure that buildings, and historic buildings particularly, have stewards who can keep the buildings going into the future. And so for when they don't have the capacity, that's where you would want to talk to different professionals who can help you figure out how to navigate the process.
Thank you for that, Nikita. So last piece here. So you have a podcast, and tangible remnants, which is absolutely incredible, amazing. Can you share with us a little bit about that podcast and how people can get connected to you?
Absolutely. And Monica, thank you for joining the podcast in one of the early episodes. So I started the podcast in 2020 as a conversation between me, myself, and I in my closet during COVID, because it was one of those things where I have a diverse group of friends. And so I realized that some of them, particularly some of my white friends, were very much like, after George Floyd got killed, very much like, oh, this isn't who we are. I can't believe this is happening. And I was kind of like, what do you mean this isn't who we are as the United States? Like, unfortunately, this is very much on brand. And kind of thinking through all the other numerous Black people who've been murdered by police officers, and just a lot of the trauma that's happened. And so realizing that as a Black woman who has a lot of mixed race friends, as an architect who does a lot of sustainability and preservation, and just realizing I had a vantage point that was a little bit different than many other people. And so I figured I would start talking and sharing. And then I also realized that I know a lot of amazing people like yourself, and a lot of people of color in the profession that weren't getting the attention or the spotlight, or even just the vantage point and the platform to talk about their story and their process. So I just started inviting people onto the podcast to share their story, share what they're doing. And it's been fun. So it's been architects, developers, preservationists, engineers, a number of different people, really just telling their story and how they got into the profession. Because I really want to inspire the next generation of everyone to be in the built environment, because there is so much space and so many ways that we can impact the world. And so wanting to share different ways to make that happen. And so it's on, you can find it anywhere podcasts are, you can hear them. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of those. And then I'm also on Instagram at the handle that you see scrolling at the bottom.
All right. So everyone, please make sure to follow Tangible Remnants. I mean, those conversations are important, and they were missing when we both were, coming up in our preservation, Nakita, and architecture. These discussions were not really happening. So to have a podcast or a place where you can go to understand how to enter the field, or what people's experiences have been in the spaces of design, engineering, all of that is there on the podcast. So I highly encourage y'all to check that out. So Nikita, that was my last question. This has been a great conversation, and I really, really appreciate you for taking some time with us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, okay, so All right, thanks, Nikita. So, everyone, thank you for joining in. This was our last interview for the year, but we will be back in the new year with a new format. So, stay tuned for that. And for everyone still watching, have a great new year, and we will see you in 2024. Thanks, y'all.